The nightmare on the frontier when the Comanche riders struck. One peaceful morning turned into chaos in an instant. Rachel Parker Plummer could hardly believe her eyes. Just moments ago, the fields were empty, but now hundreds of Comanche warriors on horseback stood before the fort. No warning, no sign, just the sudden presence of death. The air filled with terror, homes were burned, families torn apart. Rachel had only seconds to realize that life as she knew it was over. Raids like these were not uncommon. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Comanche, unmatched horse warriors of the southern Great Plains, became one of the most feared forces on the frontier. Their homeland, Comanche, stretched across vast plains where the unforgiving land tolerated only those strong enough to claim it. But this land was not always theirs. The Comanche were not always the masters of the horse. Their ancestors were once part of the Shoshone people, living in the Rocky Mountains. Everything changed when Spanish horses arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. Stray horses, having escaped from Spanish expeditions, became the turning point that reshaped their destiny, granting them speed, mobility, and a new way of warfare. It didn't take long for the Comanche to become the undisputed masters of horseback warfare. They quickly surpassed rival tribes, driving the Apache off the plains and asserting dominance. Their arrival was not just a sign of battle, it was a declaration of power. By the late 1700s, the Comanche had forced the Apache into retreat and secured their hold on the plains. The treaties the Spanish desperately signed with them before Mexican independence were mere acts of survival. No one could control the Comanche with words alone. With unmatched horsemanship, they moved like the wind, striking before their enemies could react and vanishing just as quickly. And when Rachel Parker Plummer saw them storm toward the fort that fateful morning, she could do nothing but witness history, sweeping her into its tide. By the early 1800s, the tides of expansion were crashing against the borders of Comanche. The United States was pushing westward, driven by manifest destiny, a belief that Americans were meant to control the entire continent. But while settlers and soldiers surged forward, few dared to challenge the lands ruled by the Comanche, at least not at first. For a time, Comanche remained untouched. Gold fever in California drew many pioneers further west, allowing the vast stretch of the southern plains to remain in the hands of its rightful inhabitants. But this fragile peace would not last. As word spread of fertile land and new opportunities, settlers began pouring in by the thousands, eager to claim what they saw as free, open territory. The Comanche took notice. These newcomers were slow, vulnerable, and unfamiliar with the land. Unlike other tribes that had been bought, intimidated, or deceived, the Comanche had no interest in negotiation. For over 200 years, their way of life had been defined by relentless expansion through warfare. To truly understand the Comanche, one must recognize that with each passing generation, war became more than just survival. It became identity. They were not just skilled raiders, they were the best. Their mastery of the horse, their ability to strike without warning, and their sheer dominance over the plains made them a force unlike any other. And so, when the settlers arrived, the Comanche did not see neighbors. They saw intruders, and history had already proven how the Comanche dealt with intruders. In the 1750s, the Spanish thought they were expanding their influence deeper into the frontier, but they had no idea they were walking into a trap. The Apache, longtime rivals of the Comanche, approached the Spanish with a deceptive request. They claimed they wanted to convert to Christianity and persuaded the Spanish to build a mission in Presidio San Sabá, deep in the heart of what was, in reality, Comanche territory, modern-day central Texas, near Maynard. But the Apache had no interest in conversion. What they really wanted was to lure the Spanish into a war with the Comanche, their most feared enemy. For decades, the Apache had been losing ground, pushed further and further away by the Comanche's superior horsemanship and relentless warfare. By tricking the Spanish into setting up a permanent outpost, the Apache hoped to ignite a battle that would weaken both sides. And in March of 1758, that plan became reality. On the morning of March 16, 1758, the soldiers at Presidio San Sabá awoke to a chilling sound, the war cries of 2,000 mounted Comanche warriors echoing through the plains. At first, the Comanche approached as if they came in peace, but it was all a deception. The Spanish looked out from their walls and saw an army unlike any they had ever faced before. But the Comanche didn't attack the fortified Presidio. They had a different target in mind. Nearby stood the San Sabá Mission, home to Spanish priests and missionaries. The Spanish, heavily outnumbered, could do nothing but watch in horror as the Comanche stormed the mission, slaughtered the priests, looted the site, and then burned it to the ground. It was not just an attack, it was a message. The Comanche remained outside the Presidio for days, ensuring that their victory was not ignored. Before leaving, they made their final statement, slaughtering Spanish cattle, crippling their food supply, and vanishing back into the plains. This was the moment when Spain truly understood what they were up against. The Comanche were not a tribe that could be converted, subdued, or controlled. They were warriors, raiders, and the undisputed rulers of the southern plains. And this was only the beginning. By the 1800s, settlers pushing into Comancheria were beginning to understand a hard truth. This was not their land to claim, and survival was never guaranteed. One moment their homes were peaceful, their crops growing, their families safe. The next, the distant thunder of hooves signaled the arrival of Comanche warriors, moving faster than anyone thought possible. The wolves were at the door. From the early 1800s through the 1870s, settlers who dared to build lives on the frontier faced an enemy unlike any other. The Comanche were not just raiders, they were masters of war, their strategies so effective that they became legendary. Unlike other tribes, their attacks were not random. Every raid was calculated, swift, and precise, built on generations of experience. When the Comanche gathered for war, they could move in small, silent groups or unite in massive war parties, as seen in San Sabá, 1758, where thousands rode together. Their greatest advantage was the horse. No other people on the plains could match their speed. They could cover distances no settler, soldier, or rival tribe could ever hope to cross in the same amount of time. But raiding was never reckless. The Comanche understood the land in ways outsiders never could. They timed their attacks with the rhythms of nature. When the spring grass returned, so did the warriors, ensuring their horses had plenty to graze on as they rode across the plains. They waited for clear nights and full moons, using the light to strike under cover of darkness, something even the Apache, bound by spiritual taboos, avoided. Settlers came to fear these nights, calling them the Comanche moon, a time when danger was at its peak. The violence that followed was swift and brutal. No one knew this better than Nelson Lee. A cattle driver captured by the Comanche in 1855, he witnessed firsthand the terrifying efficiency of a Comanche raid. His party of 19 men was attacked just after 1 a.m., the warriors screaming war cries as they charged in, faces painted in demonic black. Before Lee even had time to react, he was lassoed, dragged to the ground, and taken captive. All around him, his men were slaughtered. The next morning, he saw the aftermath. Bodies hacked apart, scalped, dismembered, tongues pulled out and impaled on sticks. The message was clear. This was Comanche land, and those who trespassed paid the price. But for those who survived, death was often the kinder fate. Comanche captives were put to the ultimate test. Lee recalled ceremonies where warriors danced around their prisoners, slicing at them with stone knives, testing their endurance. Those who showed fear suffered worse fates. 2 of his fellow captives were scalped alive before being put out of their misery with an axe. The Comanche didn't just raid for survival. They raided to prove dominance. In their world, a man's true worth was measured not in wealth or words, but in his ability to endure pain, to fight, and to never show fear. Herman Lehman, a white settler who was taken as a child and raised among the Comanche, later wrote of these brutal tests. They were not about cruelty for its own sake. They were about something deeper. Only the strong could walk the path of a Comanche warrior, and for those who stood in their way, the Comanche moon was always waiting. In May of 1836, the morning sun cast its golden light over Parker Fort, a stronghold built deep in the heart of Comancheria. Inside its 12-foot walls, settlers believed they had found safety. They had come seeking land, opportunity, and a future, but they had chosen a place already claimed, a land where the Comanche had ruled for generations. And on this day, the Comanche were coming to remind them of that. Among those inside was Rachel Parker Plummer, just 17 years old, with striking red hair. A wife, a mother, and soon a captive. As the men of the fort stepped out to tend the fields that morning, the land was still. Then came a single cry, "Indians!" Rachel ran to the blockhouse, her heart pounding. She peered over the walls and saw something that would be burned into her memory forever. 1 minute, the fields were clear. The next, more Indians than I dreamed possible were in front of the fort. Inside the fort, Benjamin and Silas Parker tried to decide what to do. The warriors raised a white flag, a gesture that could mean peace or a trap. Benjamin, the older of the two, believed the walls would not hold. If anyone was to survive, they had to buy time. He stepped forward to meet the Comanche, knowing what might happen. At first, the warriors spoke calmly. They asked about water, about a place to camp, even about food. But Benjamin knew better. The Comanche always knew where water was, and their horses were still wet from a recent river crossing. When he returned to the fort, he warned everyone inside, "They are not peaceful. The women and children must leave." Now, but Benjamin knew what had to be done. Before anyone could stop him, he walked out once more. This time there was no conversation. The Comanche closed in. Rachel was running, clutching her 18-month-old son, desperate to escape through the back gate. She heard the first scream, then gunshots. The attack had begun. She ran. The Comanche followed. Others sprinted for the tree line, but Rachel was slower, burdened by her child. To the warriors, she was an easy target. She had barely covered 200 yards before they caught her. They ripped her son from her arms. She fought back, clawing, kicking, screaming, until she felt the first blow. She was knocked to the ground. From inside the fort, rifle shots rang out. For a fleeting moment, she dared to hope. Had help arrived? Were the settlers pushing back? But then silence. The gunfire had come from inside the fort. The last of its defenders had fallen. Rachel was dragged back, her red hair gripped by a warrior's fist. When she was thrown to the ground, she landed next to Benjamin Parker's body. His chest was pierced with arrows, his body mutilated beyond recognition. One by one, the Comanche walked past, stabbing his lifeless body with spears, a final show of dominance. Through her own bloodied vision, Rachel scanned the chaos. Where was her son? And then she heard him, crying. She saw him, perched on a Comanche horse, held by 2 women of the tribe. She tried to run to him, but 2 warriors grabbed her, whipping and beating her until she stopped resisting. Soon, the other captives were gathered. Among them was Cynthia Ann Parker, just 9 years old, a name that history would not forget. The warriors who brought them out held scalps still dripping with blood. One was gray. Rachel knew instantly. It was Silas. Years later, she would learn the truth. Silas Parker had made his final stand, taking 4 Comanche warriors with him before he fell. As the captives stood helpless, the Comanche looted the fort, taking what they needed and destroying the rest. They slaughtered the cattle they couldn't take, leaving nothing for any who might return. Then, with their prisoners in tow, they rode toward the high plains, leaving Parker Fort in ruins, another victory in the war for the frontier. Rachel Parker Plummer, covered in blood and grief, had lost everything in a single morning, and her journey was only beginning. The Parker Fort Massacre, 1836, remains one of the most well-known Comanche raids in history. If not the most famous, it stands alongside the Great Raid of 1840 and the San Sabá Massacre, 1758, as defining moments in the struggle for dominance over the Texas frontier. Inside the walls of Parker Fort, 34 settlers believed they had found safety. But on May 19, 1836, their illusion of security shattered. The Comanche had arrived. Despite the scale of the attack, the warriors did not come simply to kill. When the dust settled, only 5 settlers were dead. Another woman had been wounded, struck in the chest by an arrow. 5 people were taken captive, among them Rachel Parker Plummer, her young son, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a name that would one day be remembered far beyond the frontier. But here's what might surprise you. 23 settlers escaped. Nearly 2/3 of those inside the fort managed to flee. And this was no accident. For the Comanche, raiding was about resources, not slaughter. The goal was not just to take lives, but to take what was valuable: horses, food, weapons, and sometimes people. In war, captives were a resource, whether as slaves, trade goods, or future tribal members. Cynthia Ann Parker herself would go on to live among the Comanche, fully embracing their way of life and becoming the mother of Quanah Parker, the last great war chief of the Comanche Nation. Once the Comanche had made their point, their focus turned to plunder. Just as they had done at San Sabá, they stripped the fort of anything useful, destroyed what remained, and killed off the livestock they couldn't take. They could have razed the entire settlement, but they didn't need to. They had won. Comanche warriors understood something that many on the frontier failed to grasp. Warriors were not expendable. Every loss was deeply felt, every fallen fighter a wound to the strength of the tribe. Replacing a warrior took years, sometimes decades. Unlike their enemies, the Comanche could not afford to waste lives recklessly. This is why they chose their battles carefully, striking where the enemy was weakest, where the reward was greatest, and where the risk was minimal. The Parker Fort raid was not just a battle. It was a message, and for those who survived, their story was just beginning. For 2 years, Rachel Parker Plummer lived as a captive among the Comanche, enduring a fate few could imagine. Her story is one of suffering, survival, and an encounter with a world completely different from the one she had known. Captured in May of 1836 during the Parker Fort Massacre, Rachel was quickly separated from her 18-month-old son, torn from the only connection she had left to her past life. Along with Cynthia Ann Parker and other captives, she was taken deep into Comanche. Rachel's existence from that point on was one of endless hardship. She was beaten, forced to work, and worse. Yet the worst tragedy of all was yet to come. When she was taken, Rachel was already pregnant with her second child. Months later, in captivity, she gave birth. But in the harsh reality of her new life, caring for a newborn was seen as a burden. And so, in one of the most horrific and heart-wrenching moments recorded from the frontier, the child was killed, its life taken because it interfered with Rachel's labor. But she was not allowed to grieve. She was forced to keep going. Yet, as time passed, Rachel's resilience caught the attention of her captors. She endured brutal treatment, but one day, after fighting back against mistreatment, she earned something unexpected, a degree of respect from the Comanche. This was the way of the Comanche people. Strength was honored, even in an enemy. In their world, courage was currency, and those who showed it, even captives, could sometimes carve out a place within the tribe. But Rachel never became Comanche. After nearly 2 years, she was sold to a trader, a common fate for captives, and from there, she was returned to her people. Once back, she did something few survivors ever had the chance to do. She wrote down her experience. Her memoir became one of the most chilling first-hand accounts of Comanche captivity, shedding light on a life few settlers had seen and lived to tell about. Yet her return to the world she once knew was short-lived. In 1839, just a few months after giving birth to her third child, Rachel died, likely from complications after childbirth. She had survived Comanche, but not the struggles of life afterward. Her story is one of many. The Comanche raids of this era left a lasting mark on the frontier, and Rachel was not the only one to experience captivity. But there was another captive whose story would take a very different turn, one that would change history. Among those taken that day was a 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. Unlike Rachel, she would never return. She would become Comanche. She would marry Chief Peta Nocona, and she would give birth to Quanah Parker, the last great war chief of the Comanche Nation. And that is why the Parker Fort Massacre remains one of the most defining moments in Comanche history.